time now for the week that was. Let's take a look at the top stories that made headlines across the globe this week. The 2022 UN Climate Change Conference, also known as COP27, marks 7 years since the Paris Agreement was adopted. For world leaders, implementing that agreement reached in Paris is a key focus at this year's summit, with stringent calls for more actions in line with existing promises. Arise environmental correspondent Leila Johnson-Salami reports on the key highlights of the conference so far.
The UN Climate Change Conference is the largest gathering for climate action in the world. The first week of COP27, ongoing in Egypt, kicked off with the Sharm el-Sheikh Implementation Summit, attended by over 120 world leaders who came together to discuss their wishes and concerns in the fight against climate change. At the start of the Implementation Summit, UN Secretary-General Antonio Guterres stated that humanity is on its way to climate hell.
And the clock is ticking. We are in the fight of our lives, and we are losing. Greenhouse gas emissions keep growing. Global temperatures keep rising. And our planet is fast approaching tipping points that will make climate chaos irreversible. We are on a highway to climate hell, with our foot still on the accelerator.
The geopolitical context which COP27 is taking place against the backdrop of this year is a fragile one. The global food and energy crisis triggered by Russia's invasion of Ukraine and growing US-China tensions have pushed climate change down the political agenda for several countries. This is as the effects of climate change continue to intensify. Leaders from developing and emerging economies urged rich nations who are most responsible for the climate crisis to deliver on promises.
We know what it is to put a man on the moon, and now we put in rover on Mars. We know what it is. But the simple political will that is necessary, not just to come here and make promises, but to deliver on them and to make a definable difference in the lives of the people who we have a responsibility to serve, seems still not to be capable of being produced.
Africa contributes less than 3% of the pollution responsible for climate change, but is most severely impacted by the ensuing crisis. Africa, and it is therefore only fair and proper that this conference takes necessary measures to recognize Africa's special needs and circumstances.
Funding for loss and damage from developed wealthy nations whose historic and current activities have largely contributed to the climate crisis is on the agenda at COP27 for the first time. And although it's not on the official agenda, discussions on gas are ongoing at COP this year, as Europe seeks fresh supplies in the wake of tensions with Russia. And African leaders and negotiators argue that the continent should be allowed to use gas, a cleaner fossil fuel, to support its energy transition. Germany's Chancellor Olaf Scholz warned against a fossil fuel renaissance.
We will move away from fossil fuels, no ifs, ands, or buts. There must be no worldwide renaissance in fossil energies. And speaking for Germany, I say this: it will not happen.
On climate finance, speaking to activists on the sidelines of COP, French President Emmanuel Macron said non-European rich nations like China and the US need to pay their fair share.
We need the United States and China to really be on board. If I were to simplify things on emissions, our battle is for the richest to be present, to pay their fair share, and on this point, let's be clear, I need us to say things: the Europeans pay, but we are the only ones to pay.
Arriving at the conference late, US President Joe Biden apologized for the US pulling out of the Paris Agreement in 2020.
The climate crisis is about human security, economic security, environmental security, national security, and the very life of the planet.
And US climate envoy John Kerry addressed global leaders, stating that the US is working as hard as it can to deliver President Biden's pledge to provide $11.4 billion a year by 2024 to help developing countries to green their economies.
Our administration is working as hard as we can to deliver on President Biden's pledge to quadruple climate support by 2024. And we are absolutely committed to doing our part. But even as we do that, I know that's not enough money.
His speech was interrupted by a climate activist who accused him of promoting false solutions.
This is what I was talking about.
Campaigners are known to hold demonstrations at annual COP events. This year, there are fewer demonstrations because of a crackdown on protests and dissent in Egypt. But protesters have still gathered outside the venue, even K-pop fans. The first week of COP27 saw South Africa sign a loan agreement with Germany and France for the two European nations to extend €300 million each in concessional financing to Africa's largest polluter. Climate finance is an important aspect of addressing the global climate crisis. However, there are concerns about the path to net zero, creating more debt for developing countries and emerging economies.
At the end of this session,
to accelerate climate finance and investment in green infrastructure in Africa, the African Development Bank, the AU and partners launched the Alliance for Green Infrastructure in Africa. The Africa Carbon Markets Initiative was also inaugurated this week, aiming to establish carbon credits as one of Africa's top export commodities by 2050. And the Sharm el-Sheikh Adaptation Agenda was announced, to enhance resilience for 4 billion people living in the most climate-vulnerable communities by 2030.
This agenda is a comprehensive, shared agenda to rally global action around 30 outcomes that are needed to address the adaptation gap and achieve a resilient world by 2030. The agenda aims at accelerating transformative action by countries, regions, cities, businesses, investors, and civil society to adapt to the acute climate hazards facing vulnerable communities.
Other agreements reached this week include the signing of an MOU between Israel, Jordan, and the UAE to develop a 600-megawatt solar photovoltaic. And governments representing over half of global GDP announced a plan to accelerate decarbonization of 5 major sectors. On the race to net zero, Chinese envoy Xi Zhenhua has stated that China is ahead of many developed countries in transitioning to renewable energies.
China's renewable energy reached 1.12 billion kWh by the end of last year. What does that mean? It means the combined installed capacity of renewable energy in many developed countries is less than that of China.
He also used the opportunity to reaffirm that the US-China climate accord is suspended.
When our cooperation was going very well, Speaker of the United States House of Representatives visited Taiwan. She violated China's sovereignty and hurt the feelings of Chinese people, violated the spirit of the 3 China-US joint communiques. So we announced the suspension of climate change cooperation with the United States. But who should be blamed for this? It is the United States.
Negotiations, discussions, and demonstrations will continue throughout the second and final week of COP. Thematic days on gender, water, energy, and biodiversity will also hold. There's been some progress, but the pledge of $100 billion in annual climate finance to developing countries has never been met. And there's no clear plan yet on doubling finance for adaptation by 2025. Just how much will be achieved remains to be seen. Leila Johnson-Salami, Arise News.
Now, earlier in the week, the COP27 presidency launched the Sharm el-Sheikh Adaptation Agenda, a shared set of goals to rally global action around 30 outcomes that are needed to address the adaptation gap and achieve a resilient world by 2030. Arise environmental correspondent Leila Johnson-Salami put together a full report about the agenda.
Implementing action for climate adaptation is a key focus at this year's UN Climate Change Summit. In response to the devastating impacts of climate change affecting vulnerable people all over the world, the COP27 presidency has launched the Sharm el-Sheikh Adaptation Agenda in partnership with the UN Climate Change High-Level Champions and the Marrakesh Partnership.
This agenda is a comprehensive, shared agenda to rally global action around 30 outcomes that are needed to address the adaptation gap and achieve a resilient world by 2030. The agenda aims at accelerating transformative action by countries, regions, cities, businesses, investors, and civil society to adapt to the acute climate hazards facing vulnerable communities.
The Sharm el-Sheikh Adaptation Agenda is coming as research published by the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change warns that almost half of the world's population will be at severe risk of climate change impacts by 2030, even if the target of limiting global warming to 1.5 degrees above pre-industrial levels outlined in the Paris Agreement is met. The adaptation agenda is laid out across 5 impact systems.
Collectively, these outcomes represent the first comprehensive global plan to rally both state and non-state actors behind a shared set of adaptation actions that are required by the end of this decade across 5 impact systematic systems: food and agriculture, water and nature, coastal and oceans, human settlements and infrastructure, and including enabling solutions for planning and finance.
Some of the targets include expanding access to clean cooking for 2.4 billion people through at least $10 billion a year in innovative finance, investing $4 billion to secure the future of 15 million hectares of mangroves, and protecting 3 billion people by installing smart and early warning systems. Adjusting to the impacts of climate change through adaptation has received far less funding and attention than mitigation for a long time, a point highlighted by UN Climate Change High-Level Envoy, Dr. Mahmoud Mohildeen.
80% of finance coming, as little as it comes in absolute figures, but 80% and more are dedicated to mitigation efforts, like financing renewables and alternative energy. These are the figures from the MDBs. Around 20% are going to adaptation. This needs to change, especially that the private sector found the business case for it. We need more finance for adaptation. I think paying attention to this issue is very much important.
With this agenda, the COP27 presidency and its partners are emphasizing the urgency for counting with evidence-based, actionable adaptation plans. But the agenda's success will be determined by the commitment of all actors involved. Leila Johnson-Salami, Arise News.
All right, and joining me, of course, is Steve Ironade. Good morning, Steve.
Good morning, Abby. Thank you very much. Lagos is now a city of marathons, so
absolutely.
we just have to show some understanding, particularly that is for the women folk, today.
It's a good cause at the end of the day.
It is, but, sometimes things have to be better communicated, for a mega city like this.
Absolutely.
Absolutely.
But, well, we're here now. That's what matters.
Yeah.
Great report, as usual, from Leila Johnson-Salami. Yeah. Of course, this is a core topic, COP27. Yeah. And if we go back and look at COP26, of course, this is, well, the many COPs that we've had in previous times. The Paris Agreement, and in terms of, African countries have said, look, we are sort of bearing the brunt of something that we have very little or nothing to do with.
That's right.
And it's costing us so much. I know so many efforts are being undertaken on the part of the West, but what are the ramifications of this in the real sense for African countries? The cost is quite alarming.
It is. I think what Leila's reports have shown is that this is something that we must continue to talk about. Yeah. And I like the fact that practically all the leading presidential candidates in Nigeria today are following on the cues of the president and the vice president, Professor Yemi Osinbajo, to have a definitive position on the issue of climate change. They will need to take it, a notch higher for Africa to speak with one voice. I think, of course, that COP27 provided an opportunity to again say that this is where we are, this is where we're headed. But then what should be the position of Africa? It has to be uniform, it has to be solid, and you have to have courageous leaders who will say that our contributions to this issue is very little, but then we bear, as you said, the brunt of it. There must be encouragement to Africa in dealing with it as we move along. And this is about the United States, China, and of course the EU zone, being proactive and not playing games.
The biggest contributors.
Not playing games, not playing politics, and understanding that Africa will have to move at its own pace, and it will need some kind of motivation and encouragement, to be able to. But nobody can avoid this topic, and I like the fact that attention,
it's constantly being drawn to it.
Absolutely, that's the takeaway for me from that.
Right.
All right, Ghana's inflation rate climbed more than expected in October, raising pressure on the central bank to continue increasing borrowing costs that are already at a more than 5-year high. Annual inflation quickened to 40.4% in Africa's second largest gold producer, compared with 37.2% a month prior. Government statistician Samuel Kobina-Anim told reporters Wednesday in the capital, Accra, that exceeded the median expectation of 39.5% of 3 economists in a Bloomberg survey. The agency last month changed its reference year to 2021 from 2018.
Yeah,
Ghana is in the eye of the storm, isn't it? All of a sudden, the darling Ghana is now struggling as one of the, the city is probably one of the weakest, on the continent now. And inflation is just, out of the rules. Lessons for everybody.
Yes.
It's not something for Nigerians to say that, look at what is Ghana, we're faring better. No, that's not the point. But then lessons that must be takeaways, there must be things that we can learn from Ghana. It is just not good, and it doesn't look good at all, that when the list is being compiled, you find Nigeria on the bottom, with Ghana far, far, far down there.
Yes.
There are issues. Ukraine, Russia are major issues. But then the management of the economy, the management of forex issues, of the currency in Ghana and in Nigeria, are things that, the authorities will have to, do a lot better, than they're currently doing.
Absolutely. And as you said, darling Ghana, unfortunately, because of course, in light of the fact that the Apex banks recently just hiked its lending rates by 10 percentage points in an attempt to, of course, try to handle and slow the city's depreciation. So, of course, the reality then kicks in and you say, wow, okay, this is happening. So, like you said, lots to learn from that.
Is the reality. The reality. The authorities will have to be truthful to the citizens to say that this is where we are. But then in doing that, the West, is also going through the same thing. But there are things that are put in place to cushion the effect. Otherwise, you would drive people, to a stage where they will have to do things that are untoward, which is what every serious government must avoid.
Absolutely.
But of course, sympathies to Ghana, but then everybody's dealing, as you know, with his own thing, isn't it? Absolutely.
Right.